The 18th of Nissan today, Yud Ches Nissan, Chalamed Pesach, the third day of the Omer. The Tanya is on page 112, the number at the top. The number at the bottom of the page is number 208, and it's in Perek Mem Aleph, chapter 41. 4 lines from the top. The Alter Rebbe is talking about how even though love is the source of all positive mitzvahs, and fear is the motivation behind the observance of the negative mitzvahs, yet it is not enough to have love even for the positive mitzvahs, love alone. You have to have fear also. And as he will say later, because fear is the way that an Eved serves his master, and since we are commanded to serve God, the only way to serve is through fear. And love alone is not enough. 4 lines from the top. Another thing that he should take into account and he should contemplate in order to bring out a fear within the mind and heart. A fear of God is he should consider how the godly presence that surrounds all the worlds, and fills all the worlds. What is this godly presence? Which is God's will, as we learned earlier, that it's from God's inner will that all things are created. It's only that in creation God's will is hidden, whereas in Torah God's will is revealed. So this will of God, is clothed and revealed within the words of Torah, in the wisdom of Torah, or in the tzitzis or in the tefillin, which he is now putting on, and by reading the Torah, or by putting on the talis and the tefillin, he is bringing this light, which is God's will, he's bringing it down on himself. Which means that he brings it into contact, into revelation, in the godly soul, which is a part of God above, which is in his body. And that the neshama becomes absorbed into this presence of God, into the will of God, in a revealed state. So earlier, in telling us what to consider in order to arouse a fear of God, the Alter Rebbe mentioned a number of things. First of all, he should consider God's greatness, in that God's kingdom is on all the worlds. And yet, God is not interested and is not concerned with the devotion of other worlds to him. That's not what makes him king. That's not what prevails on him to be king. What makes him be king, what his kinghood, what his kingdom depends on, is only the Jewish people. And that's why he is called the King of Israel, Melech Yisrael. What does it mean that he is the King of Israel, not the King of the rest of the world? He is the King of all the worlds, but only because of the Jew. In other words, the Jew can determine whether God will be king or not. The Jews bring out the attribute of royalty, and the devotion that God shows to the world is only because of the bittul that Jews have to God, and that Jews make him king. And that's what it means when the Alter Rebbe says that he should also consider that not only does God single out the Jewish people, and in the Jewish people he singles out the individual Jew, and it's the individual Jew who can determine that God should be king of the world. As we say in the bracha, Elokeinu, and then Melech Olam. First we have to make him our God, and then he becomes the king of the world. But in addition to this, he has to consider also that God is standing on him and looking at him, scrutinizing him, and checking his inner feelings to see if he's serving God properly. What does it mean that God is looking at him, not at the rest of the world? But when God looks at the Jew, he is looking because it concerns him. Because what the Jew is doing or what the Jew is feeling has an effect on God, so to speak. whereas what the rest of the world is doing, God also sees. But that doesn't concern him as much, because he is not making himself dependent on the other parts of creation, only on the Jewish people. And as the Rebbe once spoke, that when it says Hashem Nitzav Olav, God stands on him, it doesn't mean God is standing over him, but rather that God stands on him. God depends on him. God's kingdom rests on the Jew. In the pasuk, it's a reference to Yaakov Avinu, that the tzaddik is what God's kingdom depends on. God actually stands on it, rests on it, leans on it, because that's what makes God king in the world. In addition to all this, the Rebbe is now saying that he should also consider more specifically how this godliness is revealed through the particular mitzvah that he's about to do, either through the study of Torah or through the putting on of the talis and the tefillin. And what does that do? That brings a bittul and an absorption of the neshama, of the godly soul, into the ratzon ha'elyon, into God's will, which is in the mitzvah. More specifically, derech prat, more specifically, the bittul that it brings to the neshama is that betfillin, when he's putting on the tefillin, the bittul consists of libotel v'likolel b'bechinas chachmosei u'binosei shebenafshei halikis b'bechinas chachmosei u'binosei shel Ein Baruch. The bittul that comes about through all mitzvahs is that the godly soul becomes absorbed in godliness, but more specifically, the bittul that comes from tefillin, for example, is that the person's chachma and bina become absorbed and bottled into God's chachma and bina. How is that? Hameluboshe is derech prat, because God's chachma and bina are revealed and expressed specifically, individually, the Parshas Kadesh, V'hoyaki v'yacha, which is two of the parshas that are in the tefillin. The tefillin have 4 parshas. Basically, they represent Chachma, Bina, and Das. The parsha of Kadesh Li is Chachma. The parsha of V'hoyaki v'yacha is Bina. Therefore, when the person is putting on the tefillin, his kavana is that he becomes bottle to the godliness within the tefillin, and that means specifically that his chachma and his bina become bottle and absorbed in God's chachma and bina. And what effect does that have? How does this bittul express itself? Dahainu shalei lehishtamesh b'chachmosei u'binosei shebenafshei, which means that he will not use the chachma and bina of his nefesh bilti l'Hashem levadei, other than for godly purposes. Since we're talking here about fear, this is the result of the fear of God. The fear of God produces not a desire to cleave and get closer, but rather a care and a concern to not do the wrong thing. And so he is motivated in this bittul to not use his chachma and bina for ungodly things. V'chein libotel v'lichlel, v'vatel v'lichlel b'chinas hadas shebenafshei, and also the third element of seichel, the attribute of das, that too becomes bottled and absorbed into godliness. Hakelul chesed u'gvura, and das is really made up of 2 parts, because das is the beginning, the key to the emotions, and the emotions basically go in 2 directions, positive and negative, chesed and gvura, love and fear. Shehein yira v'ava shebelibei, which are in the emotions of the human being, love and fear in the heart. And that should become bottled, b'bechinas das or elyein, hakelu chesed u'gvura. It becomes bottled and absorbed into God's das, which also includes chesed and gvura. And how does that happen? It's because God's das is melubash b'parsha Shema v'hoyim Shemaya. The das is broken down into 2 parshas, one representing chesed, one representing gvura, and those are the 2 parshas of Shema and v'hoyim Shemaya. And this is what he says in the Shulchan Aruch concerning the kavana and the intention in putting on tefillin, that the person should intend l'shabed halev ve'hamayach, that in the putting on tefillin he is devoting to God his heart and mind. And although the tefillin basically represent the mind, but in the mind itself the heart is included in the element of das, because das is already the beginning of the emotion. And that's why on the tefillin of the head, on the one side there's a shin with 3 heads, and on the other side there's the shin with 4 heads. When das develops and begins to create the emotions, it becomes 4. That's concerning the tefillin. And the specific bittul that comes from putting on tzitzis, for example, Uvatif as tzitzis, when he's wrapping himself in the talis, yechaven, he should intend, kameshikosav bezehar, as he writes in the Zehar, lahamshich olav malchusei yizbarich, to bring upon himself God's kingdom. Asher hi malchus kol elamim, because God is the king of all the worlds, and you want to bring that kingdom into focus on himself, liyachada oleinu, to specify and to single out this kingdom, that it should be on us, on the Jewish people, al yedei mitzvah zu, and it happens through the mitzvah of tzitzis. Vehu ki inyan seim tosim alecha melech, and this is the mitzvah of making for yourself a king. How do you make yourself a king? Either you have one or you don't have one. But here we see that through the mitzvah of tzitzis, that kingdom which is on all the worlds, not alecha, not your king, by putting on the tzitzis, you affect God's attribute of royalty, that it should be united and singled out on you, on the Jew. Va'azai, and then, when the person has contemplated all of these things, afim b'chol zeis, lo tipil olav ema v'pachad, b'hizgalus libei, in spite of all this, it's possible that he will not be overcome with a fear and an awe in the revealed heart. In other words, an actual, palpable emotion of fear. It's almost like the Rebbe is surprised that even after all this, a person can be so dull that he doesn't react with a full-blown emotion of fear. In spite of this lack of a full-blown emotion, since he is accepting upon himself the kingdom of heaven, and he's bringing upon himself, at least in the revealed mind, in his thought and in his will, he senses the fear. In his mind, the Kabbalah zuhi amitis b'lishim safek, and this acceptance of heaven and of the fear that he senses in his mind is certainly true without any doubt. It is valid, it's authentic, shaharei hitev v'nafshis kol Yisrael, because in fact it is the nature of every Jew, to not rebel, to not go against God. And therefore, when he reveals this even to the minor degree of this lower level of fear, which is a fear in the mind and not a full-blown emotion in the heart, but this fear in the mind is not a meaningless and superficial thing. It is real and genuine, because in fact, at the core, the Jew does have a fear of God by nature. So what he is thinking and feeling in his mind is the echoing of that fear that has been revealed at least to the mind. So it's not just a passing thought, it's a true experience of fear. Therefore, Harei ha-Torah shalemet, the Torah that he's learning and the mitzvah that he's performing as a result of this acceptance of the kingdom of heaven, and because of the feeling of fear that he has in his mind, that's what's motivating the mitzvah. It is therefore called a valid and true Aveda. Just as all service that a slave or a servant does for his master or for his king. So with this fear, even though it's a minimal fear, but yet it is valid, and it makes the mitzvahs that a person does into an avodah. Whereas with love alone, as he said earlier, doing the mitzvah, even the positive mitzvah, like putting on tefillin, studying Torah, wearing the talis, these are all positive mitzvahs, and yet there has to be this element of fear. Because if he does it out of love alone, then it's a mitzvah, of course, and it has a kavanah, but it doesn't have the element of avodah. It's not called a service. Whereas if the person performs the mitzvah or studies the Torah with love alone, and he's doing it because he wants to cleave to God through Torah and mitzvahs, this is not called Einon Nikras B'Shem Aveda So'eved. This is not called the Aveda of a servant. And that's not proper, that's not acceptable, because HaTorah Omra, Torah itself says, Va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem, that you have to serve God. There has to be this element, this dimension of service. It also says, Va'isei ta'avedu. So we see clearly that in addition to the virtue of ahava, of loving God and fearing God, there also has to be the serving of God. And the serving of God comes only through fear, not through love. As he writes in the Zehar, in Parsha Bahar, Kehai Tudo, that it's like the ox. In the case of an ox, of an animal, that first you have to put a yoke on him. Begin li'afka minei tav la'alma, in order to bring out from the animal some benefit for the world. Before the animal can benefit the world, it first has to accept the yoke. It has to be yoked. Hachinami, in the same way, the Zehar says, Itzrich l'barnash, the human being also needs l'kabolo alei el malchus shamayim b'kadmisa, to first accept upon himself the yoke of heaven, which is the element of fear, and then he can produce a mitzvah for the benefit of the world. And if this is not found in him, he doesn't have this acceptance of the yoke of heaven, then lo sharia beikdusha, then holiness does not shine on him. It says that every person has to have both dimensions and both categories of service. And they are the two elements or the two forms of service of the Eved, the servant, and the son. The son serves his father with a great devotion, and the Eved serves his master with a great devotion. But a Jew has to have both dimensions, both forms of service. He has to be God's servant, and he has to be God's son. Generally speaking, Eved serves out of fear, and a son serves out of love. And although there is also a condition where a person is a son serving God out of love, and at the same time he also has the virtues of a servant, the two rolled into one, so the Alter Rebbe says it's not that you can be a son alone and have the virtues of an Eved, because the person who is on that level got there only through having fear first. Because you can't reach this level of the son who is also a servant without first having a high level of fear, as is known to those who are familiar. So the Rebbe establishes that in order to be in the service of God, it is not enough to have ahava itself. You have to have an element of fear, even if it's a minimal fear. But this is necessary even in the performance of positive mitzvahs, although we generally say that love is what motivates positive mitzvahs. And that's true. But the element of fear is necessary in order for that mitzvah to be considered service. The service of an eved, of a servant. In the Hayom Yom for today, the 18th of Nissan, the third day of the Eimer, the Rebbe writes that in the year 1848, in English, the Etaf Reish Ches, the Tzemach Tzedek said a Maimer on the Posuk in Kesef Talva. If you will lend money, or if one Jew lends money to another Jew, which is part of the Kriya for this day. And in the Maimer, the Rebbe said that Kesef, which means money, is also a reference to the neshama, because the neshama is constantly striving and yearning to rise and to go upwards. And the word kesef carries also the meaning or the connotation of kesef, longing. The neshama goes upwards, as it says, the spirit of man rises upwards, whereas the spirit of the animal descends downwards. So the person, spirit of man, is a reference to the Jewish neshama, because Jews are called Adam. Atem kriyim Adam. So kesef, talve, the neshama is borrowed, is lent out to the person. God lends the neshama to the person. And it says, Yomim Yitzaru, that the days are determined, which means that there's a certain fixed amount of days that every person is given for his life. And Chosar Yemachada, if a person comes back with a day missing, Chosar Levushachada. So the neshama is missing one garment. Each day is a new garment for the neshama that it accomplishes here on earth. So when the neshama comes back missing a day, then it's missing a part of itself. And that's not a complete return or a complete repayment of the borrowed neshama.